The dust had not yet settled on her husband's grave when the bank man rode out to tell Celia Mercer that she owed more money than her ranch was worth. And that was the day she swore, standing in the hot Wyoming wind with her black mourning dress clinging to her legs, that she would never again let a cowboy's sweet words turn her head, not if he was the last man breathing between the Laramie River and the Medicine Bow Mountains. It was the summer of 1878, and the Mercer Ranch sat in a wide green valley outside the little town of Beckett's Ford, a place that had grown up around a river crossing and a trading post and had not grown much since. Celia was 26 years old, and she had been married for 4 years to a man named Thomas Mercer, who had been kind and steady and utterly unprepared for what a late spring blizzard could do to a herd of cattle strung out along a frozen creek bed. He had gone out in March to bring the cattle down from the high pasture before the storm broke, and he had not come back. They found him 2 days later, frozen against a fence post with his hand still wrapped around a lead rope, as if even in dying he had not wanted to let go of what was his. That left Celia alone on 400 acres of good grass and bad debt, with a barn that needed a new roof, a house that needed a man's hands and a woman's patience in equal measure, and a herd that had been cut nearly in half by the very storm that had taken her husband. She had a hired man, old Enos Whitfield, who had worked for her husband's father before him, and a 15-year-old nephew named Danny who had come to live with her after his own parents died of the fever 2 winters back. Between the 3 of them they managed, but managing was not thriving, and the bank in Cheyenne was not interested in stories about hard winters. It was Enos who first mentioned the drifter. "There's a fellow come through town yesterday," he said one morning in early June, leaning against the corral fence while Celia mended a bridle with a needle too thick for the leather. "Asking after work. Says his name is Paul Redmond. Rode with a trail outfit up from Texas, he says, but the outfit disbanded in Ogallala and he's been drifting since." "We can't afford to pay a drifter," Celia said without looking up. "Might be we can't afford not to," Enos said. "You've got 60 head that need branding before the county roundup, a roof that's going to let the rain right through onto your mother's old bed come the first storm, and my knees aren't what they were, Celia. I'm 61 years old. I can still work, but I can't do the work of 2 men anymore, and Danny's got a good heart, but he's 15 and skinny as a fence rail." Celia set down the bridle. She had heard about drifters before, about men who rode into a widow's life with easy smiles and empty pockets, and left with whatever wasn't nailed down, sometimes including a woman's heart. Her own sister had married such a man once, back in Missouri, and it had ended with her sister crying in a boarding house room, while the man rode off with her savings and her wedding ring both. Celia had promised herself, standing over Thomas's grave, that she would run her ranch herself or she would lose it herself, but she would not hand her fate to another cowboy's care. "I don't trust drifters," she said. "I don't trust cowboys if you want the truth of it, Enos. They ride in, they ride out, and they leave a woman holding the pieces." "Not all of them," Enos said gently. "Your Thomas was a cowboy once before he was a rancher." "Thomas is dead," Celia said, and the words came out harder than she meant them, and she was sorry the moment she said them, but she did not take them back. "I need someone reliable, someone who will still be here in October." "Well," Enos said, "you could always meet the man before you decide he's not reliable. Costs nothing to look at him." She agreed to look, mostly because she was tired of arguing and because the roof truly did need fixing before the summer storms rolled in off the mountains. Enos sent word into town, and 2 days later, in the pale gold light of a Wyoming morning, Paul Redmond rode up the lane to the Mercer Ranch on a rangy bay gelding, leading a second horse loaded with a bedroll and a battered saddlebag. And Celia Mercer stood on her porch with her arms crossed and decided, before he even opened his mouth, that she did not like the easy way he sat in the saddle. He was, she had to admit even in that first suspicious glance, a fine-looking man. Perhaps 30 years old, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that curled out from beneath a hat that had seen better days, and eyes the color of good coffee, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 or 4 days. He wore a faded blue shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had been resoled more than once, and there was nothing about him that spoke of wealth or ease, but there was something in the way he moved, unhurried and certain, that made a woman look twice even when she did not want to. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Enos Whitfield sent word you might have work for a hand who knows cattle and carpentry both." "Enos exaggerates my need," Celia said. "I have a roof and a herd, Mr. Redmond, and precious little money to pay for help with either." "I didn't come asking after wages first thing," Paul said, and there was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth that Celia found immediately irritating, because it suggested he found her prickliness amusing rather than off-putting. "Board and a fair wage when the cattle sell would suit me fine. I'm not looking to get rich off a widow's ranch, ma'am. I'm looking for honest work and a roof of my own to sleep under for a season, since I've been sleeping under the sky more nights than I'd like this past year." "That's exactly the kind of thing a man says when he wants something," Celia said. Paul's smile did not waver, but something in his eyes went quieter, more careful. "I reckon you've got your reasons for thinking that, ma'am, and I won't pretend to know them. But I'll tell you plain, I'm not that kind of man, and I don't expect you to believe me on my word alone. I'd only ask you let me prove it." Celia studied him for a long moment. Behind her, she heard Danny's footsteps on the porch boards, and she knew without turning that the boy was staring at the stranger with the particular hunger of a fatherless child looking at any man who might fill some part of that emptiness. She hated how much that mattered to her decision, and hated more how much her own tired body ached for someone to help carry the weight of this ranch even for one summer. "You can stay in the bunkhouse with Enos," she said finally. $2 a week and your meals, and when the cattle sell in the fall, a share of the profit if there is any profit to be had. You work until sundown, you keep your hands to yourself, and the first time I catch you drinking or gambling away wages you haven't even earned yet, you're gone. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Paul said, and swung down off his horse with an ease that told her he'd spent more years in a saddle than out of one. "I'll earn my keep, Mrs. Mercer. You have my word on that." "Your word," Celia said, turning to go back into the house, "means precisely nothing to me yet, Mr. Redmond. We'll see what your hands can do." She did not see the way Paul Redmond looked after her as she walked away, a look that held equal parts amusement and something else, something that might have been the first faint stirring of a man recognizing, without yet naming it, that he had just met a woman worth proving himself to. The first weeks were nothing but work. Paul rose before dawn and was already in the barn by the time Celia came out to milk the 2 cows they kept, and he worked until the light failed each evening, mending fence, riding the far pastures to check on stray cattle, helping Enos sort the yearlings that needed branding before the county roundup in July. He said little to Celia beyond what the work required, and she found herself both relieved and, in some small unacknowledged corner of her heart, disappointed by his reserve. It was Danny who broke through first, as boys often do with men who are patient enough to let them. "Mr. Redmond taught me to throw a rope today," Danny announced at supper one evening in late June, his face flushed with the particular pride of a boy who has learned something new and difficult. "He says I've got a good eye for it, better than most fellows twice my age." "Did he?" Celia said, glancing across the table at Paul, who was suddenly very interested in his plate of beans and cornbread. "He says by the time the roundup comes I'll be able to help with the real branding, not just holding the gate," Danny went on. "Is that true, Mr. Redmond?" "If you keep practicing the way you did today," Paul said, "I don't see why not. You've got quick hands, Danny, quicker than I had at your age." "You must have been a fine cowboy yourself then," Danny said, "if you were slower than me and still good enough to ride with a trail outfit." Paul laughed, a real laugh that seemed to surprise even him, and Celia found herself watching his face rather than her own plate, noting how the laugh changed him, softened the hard lines that work and weather had put around his eyes. "I had some help along the way," he said. "A good foreman who didn't mind teaching a green boy the right way to do things instead of just cursing him for doing it wrong. I try to remember that when I'm the one doing the teaching now." "Where are you from, Mr. Redmond?" Danny asked, with the blunt curiosity of a boy who has not yet learned that some questions cut too close to old wounds. "Enos says you rode up from Texas." Celia saw something flicker across Paul's face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it if she had not been watching so closely. "Texas, yes," Paul said. "Grew up on a small place near Fredericksburg. My father ran cattle there until the war took most of what he'd built, and after the war it took him too, not in the fighting but after, the way it took a lot of men who came home changed. I went to work for other outfits after that. Been doing it near on 12 years now." "Do you have family still?" Danny asked. "Brothers or a mother?" "Danny," Celia said quietly, "that's enough questions for one supper." "No, it's all right," Paul said, and there was something gentle in the way he said it, as though he understood the boy's hunger for stories of other lives, other losses that might make sense of his own. "My mother passed when I was young, before the war even. I had a brother, but he died at Shiloh, so it's just been me for a good while now, going wherever the work takes me." The table was quiet for a moment, and Celia found herself thinking, against her own better judgment, that a man who spoke so plainly of his griefs was not necessarily a man without a heart worth trusting, and then she caught herself thinking it and pushed the thought away as firmly as she could manage. "Well," she said, standing to clear the plates, "family or no family, there's fence needs mending on the north pasture tomorrow, and I expect both of you to be ready to ride at first light." "Yes, ma'am," Paul said, and again there was that faint smile, and again Celia found it more difficult than she would have liked to ignore. The roof, at least, was mended within the first 2 weeks, Paul working alongside Enos to strip the old shingles and lay new ones cut from cedar that Paul had cut himself from a stand of trees along the river, splitting them by hand with a skill that told Celia he had done more with his life than punch cattle. When the first summer thunderstorm rolled through in early July, Celia lay in her bed listening to the rain hammer down and felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, that her house might actually keep her dry and warm through whatever the season brought, and she was surprised by how much that small security eased something tight in her chest. But it was not until the incident with the bull that Celia truly began to see Paul Redmond as something other than a hired hand. It happened on a hot afternoon in the middle of July, when a bad-tempered bull that Thomas had bought 2 years before, a great rust-colored brute named Old Samson that nobody but Thomas had ever fully trusted, broke through a weak section of corral fence and went charging toward the yard where Danny was working, oblivious, mending a piece of tack. Celia was at the well, and she saw it happen almost before she understood what she was seeing. The fence rail splintering, the bull's great head lowering, Danny turning too slowly, his face going white with the sudden terror of a boy who understands, in that instant, that he cannot outrun what is coming for him. Celia screamed his name, but it was Paul who moved, coming out of the barn at a dead run, snatching up a coiled rope from the fence post as he went, and he was between the bull and the boy before Celia's scream had even fully left her throat. He did not try to outrun the animal, which would have been useless against a beast that outweighed him tenfold. Instead, he threw himself sideways, waving his hat and shouting, drawing the bull's furious attention toward himself and away from the boy. And when the bull turned to charge him instead, Paul was already running for the fence, vaulting over it with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size, the bull's horns catching nothing but air and splinters of the fence rail where Paul's leg had been a half-second before. Celia reached Danny at almost the same moment Enos came around the barn with a shotgun, and between the three of them and some frantic shouting, they managed to drive old Samson back through the broken section of fence and into a smaller pen where he could do no more harm until proper repairs could be made. It was only after, when the danger had passed, and Danny was sitting on an overturned bucket shaking with the particular tremors that come after fear has drained out of a body, that Celia turned to look at Paul and saw the blood soaking through the leg of his trousers where the fence rail, shattered by the bull's charge, had torn a long gash along his calf. "You're hurt," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, edged with a fear she did not want to examine too closely. "It's not deep," Paul said, though his face had gone pale under its tan. "Looks worse than it is." "Sit down," Celia said, in a tone that did not invite argument, and to her mild surprise he obeyed her at once, lowering himself onto the same overturned bucket Danny had vacated, and she knelt beside him in the dust of her own yard, not caring in that moment that her skirt was getting filthy, and pulled his trouser leg up to examine the wound. It was long, a good 6 inches, and deep enough that it would need stitching, but Paul had been right that it had missed anything that might have crippled him. "I need to clean this and sew it shut," she said. "Enos, bring the whiskey and my sewing kit from the house, and the clean bandages from the shelf above the stove." "Yes, ma'am," Enos said, already moving. "You didn't have to do that," Celia said quietly, once Enos was out of earshot, still kneeling in the dust with her hands pressed against the edges of the wound to slow the bleeding. "You could have been killed." "Wasn't going to stand there and watch that bull run down a boy," Paul said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, as though throwing himself in front of a charging bull to save a child that was not his own required no particular thought at all. "Danny's a good kid. Reminds me some of myself at that age, before I understood how fast things can go wrong in this life." Celia looked up at him then, really looked, and found him watching her with an expression that made something in her chest ache in a way she had not felt since long before Thomas's death, since perhaps even before her marriage, some old forgotten stirring of a girl's heart that she had thought long buried under years of hard work and harder grief. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for what he had done, but they were all she had. "No need to thank me," Paul said. "Just doing what any decent person would do." "Not every man would have moved that fast," Celia said. "Not every man would have thought of the boy before himself." Paul's gaze held hers a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, and something passed between them, unspoken, that neither of them was quite ready to name. And then Enos came back with the whiskey and the sewing kit, and Celia busied herself with the practical business of cleaning and stitching the wound, grateful for something to do with her hands other than think too hard about the way her heart had lodged itself somewhere in her throat. That night, after Danny had gone to bed still shaken but unharmed, and Enos had retired to the bunkhouse, and Paul was resting his stitched leg on a chair on the porch, Celia brought him out a plate of the peach cobbler she had made that afternoon before the trouble with the bull and sat down beside him on the porch step without quite meaning to. "How's the leg?" she asked. "Sore," Paul admitted, "but I've had worse. Broke my arm once up in Montana, falling off a horse that spooked at a rattlesnake. That hurt considerably more than this. You've had an eventful life, Mr. Redmond." "More eventful than I'd have chosen, most of it," Paul said, and there was a weariness in his voice that made Celia curious despite herself. "What would you have chosen if you'd had the choosing of it?" Paul was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening yard, the mountains beyond it turning purple and then black as the last light failed. "A place of my own," he said finally. "Not a big place. Enough land to run some cattle, enough water to see them through a dry summer, a house that didn't leak. Somebody to come home to at the end of the day who'd be glad to see me, and maybe some children running around underfoot to teach the things my father taught me, before the war took the heart out of him." Celia found herself unable to look away from his face as he spoke, struck by the plain honesty of the wanting in his voice, a wanting that echoed, though she would not have admitted it aloud, her own secret hopes for what her life might yet still hold. "That sounds like a fine thing to want," she said quietly. "It does," Paul agreed. "Trouble is, wanting a thing and having the means to get it are two different animals entirely. I've been 12 years chasing that want, Mrs. Mercer, and I'm no closer to it now than I was the day I left my father's grave in Texas. You still have time, Celia said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice. Some days I believe that, Paul said, turning to look at her, and some days it feels like the years are running out from under me like water through a cracked bucket. He paused, seeming to catch himself, and a faint self-deprecating smile crossed his face. Forgive me. That's more melancholy than a porch conversation calls for. I don't mind, Celia said. It's been a long time since anyone spoke plainly to me about what they wanted from life. Thomas and I were happy, I think, but we never spoke much of dreams. We spoke of cattle prices and whether the roof would hold another winter. I sometimes wonder if we ever really knew each other's hearts at all, or if we simply built a life together out of habit and duty. That's its own kind of love, though, Paul said. Building a life with someone, day by day, even without grand declarations. I've seen marriages built on nothing but grand declarations that crumbled the first time real trouble came knocking. Yours sounds like it might have weathered worse than most. Perhaps, Celia said. I don't know anymore. Grief does strange things to memory. Sometimes I can't remember if I'm mourning the man or mourning the life I thought I was going to have. Both likely, Paul said. I don't think grief separates those things so neatly. They sat in silence for a while after that, the crickets singing in the tall grass beyond the yard, the stars coming out one by one overhead, and Celia found that she did not want the conversation to end, did not want to retreat back into the careful distance she had maintained between herself and this man for the past 6 weeks, and yet some old instinct for self-preservation made her rise from the step at last. You should rest that leg, she said. I'll check the stitches again in the morning. Thank you for the cobbler, Paul said, and for the doctoring, and for trusting me enough to let me stay even if you didn't much want to at first. I'm not certain I trust you yet, Mr. Redmond, Celia said, but there was no real heat in it anymore, only a kind of tired honesty. But I don't dislike you either, which is more than I expected to say 6 weeks ago. Paul laughed softly. I'll take that as progress, Mrs. Mercer. Good night, Mr. Redmond. Good night, Celia. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it and did not correct him, and lay awake a long while that night thinking about the particular way he had said it, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth, and finding, to her own considerable alarm, that she rather liked the sound of it. The weeks that followed brought the county roundup, a great gathering of ranchers and cowhands from all the outfits within 30 miles, converging on the wide flats near Beckett's Ford to sort and brand the season's calves before the fall cattle drives to the railhead. It was hard, dusty, exhausting work, but there was a kind of festival feeling to it as well. Families and hands from a dozen ranches camping together for the better part of a week, sharing meals around communal fires in the evenings. And it was there that Celia first saw how the other ranchers and their wives regarded Paul, and how they regarded her, standing beside him at the branding fire with her sleeves rolled up and dust on her face. That's a good hand you've taken on, Celia, said Martha Sullivan, whose husband ran the largest outfit in the valley. My Robert says he's never seen a man handle a rope the way your Mr. Redmond does. Says he could have his pick of foreman jobs at any outfit from here to the railhead if he wanted one. He's not looking for a foreman job as far as I know, Celia said, feeling strangely defensive on Paul's behalf, though she could not have said why. Well, he's certainly looking at you when he thinks nobody's watching, Martha said, with the particular knowing smile of a woman who has been happily married for 20 years and takes considerable pleasure in matchmaking others. And I don't think it's your branding skills he's admiring, dear. Martha, Celia said, flushing, he works for me. That's all there is to it. If you say so, Martha said, clearly not believing a word of it, and moved off to check on the stew pot before Celia could argue further. Later that evening, after the branding was done for the day and the cattle had been driven back into the holding pens, Celia found herself walking along the edge of camp with Paul, ostensibly to check on a mare that had gone slightly lame that afternoon, though in truth the mare's lameness was minor enough that it hardly required the two of them to walk half a mile from camp to see to it. "You did well today," she said, as they walked. "Even Robert Sullivan was impressed, and he doesn't impress easily." "I had good teachers," Paul said, "and a good deal of practice. 12 years of roundups does teach a man something, even if it hasn't taught him how to hold on to much of anything else." "You keep saying things like that," Celia said, "about not having much to hold on to. Do you truly believe that, or is it simply a habit of speech?" Paul was quiet for a moment, watching the mare pick her way carefully over the uneven ground ahead of them. "I suppose it's become something of a habit," he admitted. "It's easier to expect nothing than to hope for something and have it taken away. I learned that lesson early, and I've had it confirmed more than once since." "What happened?" Celia asked, softer now. "Before Texas. Before the war took your father and your brother. What is it you're not telling me, Paul Redmond?" He glanced at her, surprised perhaps by the directness of the question, or perhaps simply by her use of his given name for the first time, and for a moment she thought he might deflect the question as he had deflected so many others over the past weeks. But then he sighed, and something in his shoulders seemed to loosen, as though he had been carrying a weight for so long that the mere acknowledgment of it brought some small relief. "I was married once," he said, "before the war ended when I was barely 20 years old. Her name was Sarah. We'd known each other since we were children, grown up on neighboring places outside Fredericksburg, and it seemed the most natural thing in the world that we should marry once we were both old enough. We were married less than a year when the fever came through the county. Took her and the baby both, before I even had the chance to see whether it would be a son or a daughter." Celia stopped walking, staring at him in the fading light. "Paul, I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago," Paul said, though the rawness in his voice suggested it did not feel so very long ago to him even now. "I was young enough that I thought the grief would kill me too, for a while. Old enough, I suppose, that I should have known better than to think that. But after that, and then losing my brother at Shiloh not 2 years later, and my father not long after that from a broken heart as much as anything a doctor could name, I suppose I stopped letting myself want things too badly. Easier to drift from one outfit to the next, never staying long enough anywhere for the wanting to take root again." "And yet you told me on the porch that you still wanted those things," Celia said. "A place of your own, someone to come home to." "I did say that," Paul admitted. "I suppose some part of a man never entirely gives up wanting, no matter how hard he tries to convince himself otherwise. I've just gotten good at pretending I don't most days." He paused and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something unguarded and searching. "Some days lately, the pretending's gotten harder." Celia's heart was beating very fast, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warm evening air between them, of the way the last light of the sunset was catching in his dark eyes. "Why is that, do you suppose?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, and was frightened by how much she wanted to hear him say it. "You know why, Celia," Paul said quietly. "I think you've known for some weeks now, same as I have. I didn't come here looking for it. I wasn't looking for anything but honest work and a roof over my head for a season. But I'd be lying to you, and to myself, if I said I hadn't come to feel something for you that goes a good deal further than what a hired hand ought to feel for the woman who pays his wages." "Paul," Celia said, and his name came out almost like a warning, though she was not certain in that moment what exactly she was warning against. "I know you swore off trusting cowboys," Paul said. "Enos told me, back before I even took this job, that you'd had hard luck with men who rode in and rode out again, leaving nothing behind but trouble. I understand that caution, Celia. I've got my own share of scars from loving and losing. But I'm not looking to ride out again, not this time, not if you give me some reason to believe I might have a place to stay." Celia felt tears pricking unexpectedly at her eyes, tears she had not shed even at Thomas's funeral, when grief had felt too large and too strange for weeping. "I don't know how to trust that," she said. I don't know how to believe that a man might truly stay, when every man I've known who called himself a cowboy has eventually ridden away from something, whether it was a woman or a debt or simply the settled life itself. Then let me prove it, Paul said, echoing, though he could not have known it, the very words he had spoken to her on that first morning, standing in her yard with his horses and his battered saddlebag. Not with words, since words are cheap and you've every right not to trust mine yet. Let me prove it with time. Let this whole summer be my proof, Celia. If by the time the cattle sell in the fall I haven't shown you that I mean to stay, then I'll take my wages and ride on, and I won't trouble you again. But if I have shown you, if by then you believe me, I'd like the chance to ask you something a good deal more permanent than whether you'll let me keep working your fences. Celia looked at him for a long moment, this man who had thrown himself in front of a charging bull for a boy who was not his own, who had spoken of his dead wife and dead brother and dead father with a raw honesty she had rarely encountered in any man, cowboy or otherwise, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the day Thomas died began, very slowly, to loosen. "All right," she said finally. "Prove it then, Paul Redmond. But I'll warn you now, I don't give my trust cheaply, and I won't pretend to feel something I haven't yet earned the right to feel." "That's fair," Paul said, and there was a warmth in his smile that made her heart turn over in her chest. "That's more than fair. That's exactly the kind of woman worth proving myself to." They did not kiss that night, though Celia thought, walking back to camp with the lame mare limping along behind them, that they had come very close, and that some invisible line had nonetheless been crossed, some understanding reached that changed the shape of everything between them going forward. The rest of the summer passed in a strange and wonderful blend of ordinary ranch labor, and the slow, careful building of something neither of them named aloud, but both of them felt growing with each passing week. Paul continued to work as hard as he always had, mending fences and tending cattle and teaching Danny the finer points of roping and riding. But there was a new lightness in him now, a way of catching Celia's eye across the yard that made her flush and smile despite herself. Small moments of connection that accumulated, day by day, into something. Celia found herself trusting more than she had trusted anything in the 4 years since Thomas's death. There was the afternoon in early August when a sudden hailstorm caught them both out on the range, and they took shelter together beneath a rock overhang, pressed close together against the cold and the noise of the storm. And Paul had put his arm around her without asking, and she had let him, had leaned into the warmth of him and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely safe. There was the evening when Danny fell ill with a fever, and Paul had sat up with Celia through the long dark hours, fetching cool water and cloths, holding the boy's hand and telling him stories of trail drives and cattle stampedes to distract him from his misery, until the fever finally broke near dawn, and Danny slept peacefully at last, and Celia had looked at Paul across the boy's bed, exhausted and rumpled and utterly devoted to a child who was not his own blood, and felt something inside her that could no longer be denied or explained away as mere gratitude. There was the Sunday afternoon when Paul had ridden into Beckett's Ford and come back with a small paper packet of licorice for Danny and a length of blue ribbon for Celia. Nothing extravagant, nothing that cost more than a few pennies, but the gesture had struck her more deeply than any expensive gift could have, because it told her that even in town, running errands, some part of his mind had been thinking of her. And there was the trouble, too, because no summer worth telling of comes without some trouble in it. And the trouble that came to the Mercer ranch that August wore the face of a man named Silas Boone. Silas Boone owned the ranch adjoining Celia's to the east, a hard, ambitious man who had made no secret over the past 2 years of wanting to buy Celia's land outright, to fold it into his own growing empire of cattle and grass, and who had made equally little secret, since Thomas's death, of thinking that Celia herself might make a convenient addition to that empire, whether she wished it or not. He had called on her twice in the past year, each time with some pretext of neighborly concern, each time making clear in his careful, circling way that he thought a widow alone was a foolish thing to be, and that he would be glad to relieve her of both her land and her loneliness in one convenient arrangement. Celia had refused him both times as politely as she could manage, but Silas Boone was not a man accustomed to being refused, and when word reached him, as word inevitably does in a small valley, that Celia Mercer had taken up with her hired hand in something considerably warmer than an employer's regard, his patience ran out entirely. He came to the ranch on a hot afternoon in the third week of August, riding in with two of his own hands flanking him, and found Celia in the yard hanging wash on the line while Paul and Danny worked in the corral nearby, breaking a young horse to the saddle. "Mrs. Mercer," Silas said, touching his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes, "I've come to speak with you about a matter of some delicacy." "I can't imagine what business we have to discuss, Mr. Boone," Celia said, continuing to hang the wet linens without pausing in her work. "It concerns your hired man," Silas said, glancing toward the corral where Paul had stopped his work with the horse to watch this exchange with an expression Celia could not quite read from that distance. "There's talk in town, Mrs. Mercer, unfortunate talk, about the nature of your arrangement with him. I thought, as a neighbor and a man of some standing in this valley, I ought to warn you of the damage such talk could do to your reputation and to your late husband's memory." "My reputation is my own concern, Mr. Boone," Celia said, her jaw tightening. "As is my late husband's memory, which I honor a good deal more faithfully than you seem to think, given how quickly you came calling after his death with talk of buying my land." "I only mean to help," Silas said, though the smile on his face suggested otherwise. "A woman alone is vulnerable to men who would take advantage of her circumstances. This Redmond fellow, drifting in from nowhere, no family, no property to his name, no ties to hold him here. What do you truly know of him, Mrs. Mercer? Men like that have a way of charming lonely widows out of everything they own, and then riding off before the debt collectors even know they've been robbed." By this time Paul had climbed out of the corral and was walking across the yard toward them, and Celia saw him consciously slow his pace, saw him visibly working to keep his expression calm rather than give Silas Boone the satisfaction of provoking him into anger. "Mr. Boone," Paul said, stopping a respectful distance away, though there was nothing respectful in the steadiness of his gaze, "I don't believe we've been introduced properly, but I've heard your name mentioned. Seems you've taken a considerable interest in Mrs. Mercer's affairs, for a man who isn't family." "I've taken an interest in seeing this valley's widows protected from opportunists," Silas said coldly. "You do well to remember, Redmond, that men without land or standing have a way of finding themselves unwelcome in places where they've overstepped their position." "Is that a threat, Mr. Boone?" Paul asked, his voice still calm but with an edge beneath it now that made even Silas Boone's two hired men shift uneasily in their saddles. "It's a fact of how things work in this valley," Silas said. "I'd hate to see Mrs. Mercer's good name suffer for want of clearer boundaries between employer and employee. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if you sought work elsewhere, Redmond. I understand there's an outfit up near Sheridan looking for hands." "I appreciate your concern for my good name, Mr. Boone," Celia said, stepping forward before Paul could respond, her voice tight with a fury she had been holding in check since the moment he arrived. "But I am entirely capable of managing both my ranch and my reputation without your assistance. Mr. Redmond is a good and honorable man who has worked hard for this family all summer, and I'll not have you or anyone else spreading ugly talk about him, or about me simply because I have refused twice now to sell my land to you or to marry you to keep it." Silas's face went red, whether from anger or embarrassment Celia could not tell, and perhaps did not care to. "You'll regret this stubbornness, Mrs. Mercer," he said, gathering his reins. "This valley isn't kind to widows who can't manage their own land, and one bad season could see you selling to me anyway, on considerably worse terms than I've offered today. As for you, Redmond, I'd think carefully about how welcome you'll find yourself at the bank in Cheyenne, or at any outfit within 50 miles, once certain facts about your character become more widely known. What facts might those be, Mr. Boone? Paul asked, and something in his tone made Celia glance at him sharply, sensing that this exchange had touched some nerve deeper than mere neighborly antagonism. A man who abandons a debt in one county has a way of finding that debt follows him to the next, Celia said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he holds a card his opponent did not know he was playing. I have business connections in Ogallala, Redmond. Interesting things a man hears in the way of business connections. Paul's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, and after a long, tense moment, Silas Boone turned his horse and rode off with his two hands trailing behind him, leaving a silence in the yard that felt considerably heavier than before his arrival. "Paul," Celia said quietly, once the riders were well clear of the ranch, "what was he talking about?" "What debt in Ogallala?" Paul was quiet for a long moment, staring after the departing riders, and when he finally turned to face her, there was something guarded in his expression that Celia had not seen since the earliest days of his employment, before the walls between them had begun to come down. "It's not what he's implying," Paul said. "But there is a debt, and I suppose I owe you the truth of it, since you've a right to know what kind of man you've let onto your land." "I'm listening," Celia said, though her heart had begun to beat with an anxious rhythm that she did not entirely welcome. "The trail outfit I rode with, the one that disbanded in Ogallala," Paul said. "It disbanded because the owner, a man named Hargrove, ran into debts of his own and couldn't pay the crew for the last 2 months of the drive. I was the segundo, the second in command, and when Hargrove skipped out owing wages to 11 men, I took what money I had left and covered what I could of what was owed, because those men had families waiting on that pay, and I couldn't stomach the thought of them going home empty-handed on account of another man's dishonesty. It left me nearly penniless, which is why I came looking for work here in the first place. But it also left an unpaid balance at the mercantile in Ogallala, where I'd bought supplies for the outfit on credit that Hargrove was supposed to settle and never did. I've been sending what I can toward that debt ever since, a few dollars at a time, whenever I have anything to spare. It's nearly paid off now, but I don't doubt Silas Boone's business connections have heard of it, and I don't doubt he means to make it sound worse than it is." Celia felt something in her chest ease at this explanation, a fear she had not fully acknowledged even to herself dissolving into something closer to admiration. "You covered other men's wages with your own money," she said slowly, "and went into debt yourself rather than see them cheated. Seemed the only decent thing to do," Paul said, with the particular discomfort of a man unused to being praised for what he considers simple honesty. "I know it doesn't look like much from the outside, a drifter with debts trailing behind him, but I've never taken a dollar that wasn't earned, Celia, and I've never left a debt unpaid that I had the means to settle. Silas Boone can make it sound as ugly as he likes, but that's the truth of it." Celia reached out then and took his hand, the first time she had done so of her own initiative rather than accepting some gesture of his, and felt the roughness of his palm, the calluses built up over 12 years of honest labor. "I believe you," she said, "and I don't care what Silas Boone says in town, or what he thinks his business connections might stir up. I know what kind of man you are, Paul Redmond. I've watched you all summer. I've seen how you treat Danny, how you treat Enos, how you treat the animals in your care. A man doesn't fake that kind of decency for 3 months running. Either he has it in him or he doesn't, and you have it in abundance." Paul looked at her for a long moment, his eyes bright with an emotion he did not try to hide, and then he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. "Celia Mercer," he said quietly, "I think I've loved you since the day you told me my word meant nothing to you, because I understood right then that you were a woman who'd been hurt enough to demand more than words, and I decided that summer I'd give you exactly that. Something more than words." "You have," Celia whispered. "You have given me more than words, Paul." "I don't know when it happened, exactly, somewhere between the bull and the roundup and the hailstorm. But I've come to trust you more than I've trusted any man since Thomas, and perhaps even more than I trusted him, because you've had to earn it every single day, and you have." Paul cupped her face in his rough, careful hands, and this time at last he kissed her, there in the yard with the wash still hanging half-pinned on the line, and the mountain standing tall and golden in the late afternoon light. And Celia kissed him back without hesitation or fear, feeling something in her heart that had been frozen since March finally, fully thaw. Silas Boone was not, however, a man content to let a single failed confrontation end his interference in Celia's affairs, and the trouble he had promised did indeed follow in the weeks after, though not in quite the shape either Celia or Paul had expected. It began with the bank. Barely a week after Silas's visit, Celia received a letter from the bank in Cheyenne informing her that, due to certain concerns raised about the stability of her ranch's management, they were calling due the remaining balance of the loan Thomas had taken out 3 years before to purchase additional breeding stock, a loan that Celia had been paying down steadily, but that still carried a balance of nearly $600. An impossible sum to raise before the fall cattle sale, unless the bank agreed to extend the terms as they had done in previous years. "They can't do this," Celia said, her hands shaking as she read the letter aloud to Paul and Enos at the kitchen table that evening. "We've never missed a payment. Thomas set up the terms specifically to allow for payment after the fall sale when the cattle bring in the money to cover it. Boone's behind this," Enos said grimly. "I'd wager my last dollar on it. He knows people at that bank. Been doing business with them for years, buying up land from ranchers who couldn't make their payments. He means to force me to sell," Celia said, "or to sell to him directly once the bank forecloses." "We won't let that happen," Paul said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "We've got 60 head ready for the fall sale, more than we started the summer with thanks to the calves born this spring. If we can get to the railhead early, before the general fall glut drives prices down, we might raise enough to satisfy the bank even on this shortened timeline." "The railhead is 40 miles from here," Celia said. "It would take the better part of a week to drive the herd there, and the roundup isn't even scheduled until late September. We'd have to gather them early, cut out anything not ready for market, and drive them ourselves with only the 3 of us and Danny." "Then that's what we'll do," Paul said. "I've driven cattle to railheads before, Celia. It's hard work, but it's not impossible with a small herd and good weather. We start gathering tomorrow." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of exhausting labor. The 4 of them, Celia, Paul, Enos, and Danny, rising before dawn each day to gather cattle from the far pastures, sorting the herd into what was ready for market and what could wait another season, mending gear and provisioning for the drive with a careful economy that left no room for waste or error. Celia found herself riding harder and working longer hours than she had since the earliest days of her marriage, and found, too, a fierce satisfaction in it, a sense that she was fighting for something with her own 2 hands, rather than simply enduring whatever fate the bank or Silas Boone chose to hand her. Paul was a constant steadying presence throughout, patient with Danny's inexperience, gentle but firm with Enos's aging body, and unfailingly encouraging with Celia herself whenever her own exhaustion or fear threatened to overwhelm her resolve. There was a night, near the end of the gathering, when Celia broke down in tears in the barn after a difficult day, frustrated by a stubborn heifer that had nearly injured her and terrified by the mounting pressure of the bank's deadline. And Paul had simply held her, saying nothing, letting her weep against his chest until the storm of feeling passed. And then had made her laugh with some absurd story about a cook on his old trail outfit who had once mistaken a skunk for a badger with unfortunate culinary consequences, and she had gone to bed that night feeling lighter than she had in weeks despite everything still hanging over them. The drive itself, when it finally began in the first week of September, was its own trial. They pushed 63 head of cattle across 40 miles of open range, fording the Laramie River at a shallow crossing Paul knew from his years of trail work, weathering a sudden thunderstorm on the third night that nearly scattered the herd before Paul's quick thinking and steady voice calmed both the cattle and the frightened teenage boy trying desperately to hold his position on the flank. Celia rode point alongside Paul for much of the drive, learning skills she had never needed as a rancher's wife, but found herself grateful to possess now as a rancher in her own right. And by the time the railhead town came into view on the fifth day, dusty and exhausted and saddle-sore in ways she had never imagined possible, she felt a fierce pride in what the four of them had accomplished together. The cattle sold well, better than Celia had dared hope, the early arrival at the railhead meaning they beat the price drop that came with the larger fall herds still weeks away from market. And when the final tally was counted and the buyer's money was in Celia's hands, she found she had not only enough to satisfy the bank's demand but a small surplus besides. The first real profit the ranch had seen in the 2 years since the terrible blizzard that took Thomas's life. "We did it," she said to Paul that evening, as they sat together outside the small hotel where they'd taken rooms for the night before beginning the ride home, Danny and Enos already asleep after the long ordeal of the drive. "We actually did it." "You did it," Paul corrected gently. "I just helped you do what you'd already decided to do. This ranch is yours, Celia, and you fought for it with everything you had. I'm just glad I got to be there to see it." "I couldn't have done it without you," Celia said. "The drive, the cattle, none of it. And more than that, Paul, I couldn't have found the courage to fight for any of it if you hadn't shown me all summer that a man's word could mean something again. That trust wasn't a foolish thing to risk on someone." Paul reached over and took her hand, weathered now from weeks of hard riding, calloused in ways it had never been before this summer, and pressed a kiss to her palm with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I told you I'd prove myself," he said. "I meant every word of it, Celia, and I'm not done proving it, not by a long stretch. I mean to spend the rest of my life proving it if you'll let me." "Is that a proposal, Paul Redmond?" Celia asked, half laughing despite the sudden thickness in her throat. "It's the beginning of one," Paul said, "though I confess I'd rather do it properly, with a ring and a bit more ceremony than a hotel porch after a 5-day cattle drive, if you can bear to wait that long." "I've waited this long already," Celia said. "I expect I can manage a little longer if it means doing it properly." They rode home the next morning, the cattle sold and the money safely deposited with the bank in the nearest town along their route, rather than risking the full ride back to Cheyenne. And when they arrived back at the ranch 2 days later, tired but triumphant, they found a letter waiting from the Cheyenne bank confirming that the debt had indeed been satisfied and expressing, in the careful language of institutions unaccustomed to admitting error, some regret that the matter had been handled with less flexibility than the bank's usual practice, a regret that Celia suspected had rather more to do with a certain rancher's failed attempt to manipulate the loan than any genuine institutional remorse. Silas Boone, when word reached him that Celia Mercer had not only survived his interference but thrived despite it, did not call on the ranch again, though Celia heard through the gossip of Beckett's Ford that he had grumbled considerably about widows who refused good sense and about drifters who ought to have known their place, grumbling that did him no particular credit in a valley where most of the neighboring ranchers had come, over the course of the summer, to respect both Celia's determination and Paul's evident decency. The proposal, when it finally came on a golden afternoon in the middle of September, with the aspens on the mountainside just beginning to turn gold and the air carrying that particular crispness that speaks of summer's ending and autumn's arrival. Paul had asked Celia to walk with him down to the river, to the same stretch of water where, months before, he had first shown Danny how to read the current for a safe crossing. And there, with the water running clear and cold over smooth stones and the mountains rising gold and green in the distance. He had gotten down on one knee in the soft grass of the riverbank and produced, from his shirt pocket, a small ring that he explained, somewhat sheepishly. He had purchased in town, with the last of his share of the cattle sale profits, a simple band of gold with a small clear stone that caught the afternoon light. "Celia Mercer," he said, his voice steady despite the evident nervousness in his hands. "I came to this valley 3 months ago, a man with nothing but a horse and a bedroll, and a debt trailing behind him, looking for nothing more than honest work for a season. I never expected to find what I found here. I never expected to find you, or Danny, or a home that felt like mine even before I had any claim to it. You told me that first morning that my word meant nothing to you, and you were right to say it, because words are cheap, and I hadn't yet earned the right to speak them with any weight. But I've spent this whole summer trying to prove, with my hands and my heart rather than just my words, that I am a man worth trusting. I love you, Celia. I love the way you fight for what's yours. I love how fiercely you love that boy in there like he was born to you. I love how you've let me in, slowly, carefully, exactly as much as I earned and not one bit more. Because that's the kind of caution a person learns from real hurt, and I respect it more than I could ever say. I want to build a life with you here on this ranch, for however many years God grants us. Will you marry me?" Celia was crying before he even finished speaking, tears of a happiness so complete it felt almost too large for her chest to hold, and she knelt down in the grass beside him, heedless of her skirt, and took his face in both her hands. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Paul Redmond, 1,000 times yes. You've proven every category wrong that I ever swore against, and I'll spend the rest of my life grateful that you rode up my lane that morning, no matter how unwelcoming I was." "You had good reason to be unwelcoming," Paul said, laughing through what looked suspiciously like his own tears now. "I'm just glad I got the chance to change your mind." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, and Celia found herself laughing and crying at once as he pulled her into his arms and kissed her there on the riverbank, the water running past them, the aspens beginning their slow turn toward gold, and somewhere above them a red-tailed hawk cried out across the wide Wyoming sky as if in benediction. They were married in October, in the small white church in Beckett's Ford, with Eno standing as witness for Paul and Martha Sullivan standing for Celia, and Danny, dressed in a new suit that Celia had sewn for the occasion, standing proudly at the front of the church to give the bride away, since there was no other family to do it and the boy had asked, with a solemnity that made Celia's heart ache with love, whether he might have the honor. The whole valley seemed to turn out for the wedding, curious neighbors who had watched all summer, as the widow Mercer's hired hand had slowly, patiently, thoroughly won her trust and her heart, and there was considerable good-natured teasing at the reception afterward about cowboys and their reputations, teasing that Paul took in good humor, laughing along with the rest even as he kept one arm firmly around his new wife's waist. Silas Boone did not attend, which surprised no one, though he did send, some weeks later, a somewhat grudging note acknowledging that he had perhaps misjudged Mr. Redmond's character, a note that Celia suspected had more to do with his desire to maintain civil relations with a now clearly permanent neighbor than any genuine change of heart, but which she accepted graciously nonetheless, because holding on to old grievances had never been her way once a matter was truly settled. The years that followed brought their own share of hardships, as any life on a Wyoming ranch inevitably does. There were dry summers when the grass grew thin, and the cattle had to be sold earlier than hoped, and there was a bitter winter in 1881 that tested even Paul's considerable skill at keeping livestock alive through deep snow and brutal cold, a winter that brought back for Celia, in unguarded moments, the old sharp memory of the storm that had taken Thomas, though Paul always came home safely from those winter rides, sometimes half frozen and always exhausted, but always home. always returning to the fire and the warm supper and the wife who had learned, finally, fully, to trust that he would. Danny grew into a fine young man under Paul's steady guidance, eventually taking on much of the day-to-day management of the ranch's cattle operations himself as he came of age. And when he married, at 20, a sweet-natured young woman named Ruth from a neighboring ranch, Paul stood as his best man with a pride so evident that more than one guest at the wedding remarked that you would never have guessed, watching him, that Danny was not his own blood son. Celia and Paul had 3 children of their own in the years that followed their marriage. First a son, born in the summer of 1879, whom they named Thomas after Celia's first husband, a gesture that Paul had suggested himself, understanding without being told that some part of Celia's heart would always hold room for the man who had first built this ranch and this life with her, even as she built a new life now with someone else. Then a daughter 2 years later, whom they named Sarah, after the young wife Paul had lost so long ago in Texas, a gesture that moved Celia to tears when Paul first suggested it, understanding in turn that some part of his heart, too, deserved to be honored rather than buried. And finally, in 1884, a second son, whom they simply named Enos, after the old hired hand who had first suggested, all those years before, that Celia might at least look at the stranger riding up her lane before deciding he was unworthy of her trust, and who lived to see the boy grow to nearly 6 years old before he passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, having spent his final years as beloved a member of the Mercer Redmond family as any blood relation could have been. The ranch itself prospered steadily under Paul and Celia's joint management, growing from the 400 acres Celia had inherited to nearly 1,000 acres by the mid-1880s, as they purchased adjoining parcels of land, some of them, in a turn of events that gave Celia particular satisfaction, bought from Silas Boone himself when his own outfit fell into financial difficulty some years later, a difficulty brought about, ironically enough, by exactly the kind of overextension and poor management he had once accused Celia of being susceptible to. Paul handled the negotiation for that particular purchase with a graciousness that impressed even Boone, refusing to gloat or press any unfair advantage despite having every reason to do so, a restraint that Celia found herself admiring as much as any of his other qualities, understanding that true strength in a man showed itself as much in the victories he chose not to press as in the battles he chose to fight. In the evenings, once the children were grown enough to be trusted asleep in their beds without constant supervision, Celia and Paul often sat together on the same porch where he had first told her of his dead wife and lost family, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed the whole slow unfolding of their courtship. And Celia would sometimes think back to that first morning, to the suspicious, grief-hardened woman who had stood on this very porch and decided, before he had even opened his mouth, that she would not trust the stranger riding up her lane, and she would marvel at how completely, how thoroughly, that Summer had proven her wrong, not because Paul had argued her out of her caution with clever words, but because he had simply, patiently, day after day, shown her through his actions exactly the kind of man he was, until trust had grown between them as naturally and inevitably as grass grows after rain. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once, many years later, when their children were nearly grown and the ranch had become one of the most respected outfits in the valley. "Coming here, that first summer. Staying when you could have ridden on to easier prospects a dozen times over." "Not for one single day," Paul said, taking her hand in his, still calloused, still weathered by decades of hard work, but as gentle in its touch as it had ever been. "I told you once that I'd spent 12 years chasing a one I never thought I'd catch up to, a place of my own, someone to come home to, children to teach the things worth knowing. I caught up to all of it, Celia, right here on this ranch with you. I wouldn't trade one hard day of this life for an easy day of any other. Even the day Silas Boone tried to run you off my land." Paul laughed, the same laugh that had first surprised Celia all those years ago at the supper table, still as warm and genuine now as it had been then. "Even that day," he said, "because it was that very day that you finally told him and told me that you believed in me. I wouldn't trade that for anything, not even an easier path to the same place." Celia leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last light of the sunset fade over the mountains that had become, over the course of one transformative summer and all the years that followed it, not merely the backdrop of her grief but the setting of her deepest joy, and felt, as she had felt every evening for years now, an overwhelming gratitude that she had let herself be proven wrong. "I believe in you still," she said quietly, "more now than I ever thought possible that first morning you rode up the lane. And I in you," Paul said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Always, Celia. For however many years we've got left, and however many more after that, wherever it is that good hearts go when this life is through." Behind them, in the house that had once leaked in every storm and now stood solid and warm against whatever weather the Wyoming sky chose to send, their children slept safely. The ranch that had nearly been lost to grief and debt now thriving under the joint hand of a widow who had learned, against every hard-earned instinct, to trust again, and a cowboy who had spent an entire summer, and every year that followed it, proving that trust had never once been misplaced. And so it was, in the wide Golden Valley outside Beckett's Ford, Wyoming, that the story the town still told, decades later, to young couples nervous about their own uncertain futures, was not a story about a widow's caution or a cowboy's wandering ways, but a story about a summer of proof, patiently given and finally, fully accepted, and about a love that had grown, as the best loves always do, not from grand gestures alone, but from 100 small acts of honesty and courage and quiet devotion, until it stood as solid and enduring as the mountains that had watched it unfold.